I want to start today's episode by describing a moment that I've seen play out in some way, shape or form many, many times. The family report lands, your lawyer emails it to you with a note saying that they'll call you to discuss it. Some parents read the recommendation section first because, of course, it's where so many people go immediately straight to the bottom sections, the thing that can seem most like a verdict. And maybe what's there doesn't reflect what you've lived. Maybe it doesn't reflect what you know your children need. Maybe there are statements in the body of the report that you know to be factually wrong, or characterizations of you that you just simply cannot believe. Then you talk to your lawyer, and often, not always, but often, the conversation that follows can go something like this. The report writer has recommended XYZ. The other side's going to use that. We need to be realistic. You need to think about whether or not you really want to fight this. The recommendations of the report writer are going to be given significant weight. That's the moment when a lot of protective parents stop fighting. Not because the court's decided anything, not because the recommendations have been tested or cross-examined or weighed alongside the rest of the evidence, but because everyone in the room, your lawyer, the lawyer for the other side, the ICL, the independent children's lawyer, if there is one, sometimes whoever is facilitating the dispute resolution conference, can treat the family report as though it is a verdict, when the reality is that it is not. And that is one of the most important things that I'm going to say to you today, so I'll repeat it. The family report is not a verdict. Welcome to the Post-Separation Abuse Podcast. I'm your host for today's episode, Danielle Black, principal coach and an advocate. Also, someone who sat on both sides of this process. Today, we're talking about family reports, what they are, what report writers are assessing, where the system can fail protective parents, and why a report that doesn't go your way is not the end of the road. A great companion resource for this episode is called Preparing for Your Family Report. It's a comprehensive practical guide covering emotional preparation, the specific qualities that report writers can be assessing, how to frame difficult conversations, some grounding techniques, what to say and not say to your children before and after they are interviewed. I'll talk a little bit more about that companion resource at the end. What we're covering in today's episode is the strategic and systemic picture that goes alongside it. Before we talk strategy, it's important that we're all starting from the same place. A family report, sometimes called a family consultant's report, a long-form report, a single expert witness report, or a report from a court child expert, can be called a child impact report or a short-form report, is ultimately an independent expert assessment ordered by the Federal Circuit and Family Court of Australia as part of parenting proceedings. It's also not uncommon for some separated parents who disagree on parenting arrangements to agree on attending upon a private report writer for the purposes of getting expert recommendations with a view to then hopefully coming to an agreement, potentially coming to orders by consent without actually entering the court system. The purpose of a family report is to assist the parents and the court in making decisions about what arrangements are in the best interest of children. The report writer usually is someone who is a psychologist or social worker. In situations where the report has been ordered to be completed by the court, the duty of the report writer is to the court, not to either parent. The process usually involves individual interviews with both parents interviews with the children separately and in an age-appropriate way, sometimes an observation of each parent interacting with the children. This can be very dependent upon the ages of the children. They may also review court documents, affidavits, medical records, school reports, or other subpoenaed material. The report becomes a piece of evidence in your case. It can include a summary of the family background, observations of the parent-child relationships, an assessment of each parent's parenting capacity, and then recommendations about parenting arrangements. And here's the first thing that I want to unpack. The report may carry weight. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But weight is not the same as finality. I'll come back to that in a moment. What I want you to understand first is the gap between what a family report is designed to do and what it actually captures and sometimes misses. Report writers are required to have qualifications in psychology or social work and ideally some kind of training in child development, family dynamics and family violence. I say ideally because the reality is that the quality and depth of training varies significantly, and nowhere does that variation matter more than in cases involving coercive control. Coercive control is not like a black eye or a broken arm. It doesn't show up in a photograph. It's a pattern, a sustained strategic pattern of behaviour designed to dominate, isolate and destabilise another person over time. It's psychological and emotional in nature. It operates through fear, obligation and the subtle erosion of identity. And it can be incredibly difficult to detect if you have no idea what you're looking for. A report writer who has genuinely deep training in coercive control dynamics should be able to recognise that presentation. They should be able to distinguish between two parents who are in conflict, where both parties may be contributing to that dynamic, and a situation where one parent has been systematically controlled and is still being controlled in some way post-separation, and is now sitting in an interview trying to articulate that experience while their nervous system is managing a very real threat response. However, not every report writer has that depth of training, and when they don't, what they sometimes see instead is a calm, pleasant, cooperative, presenting person, and another parent who seems anxious or who contradicts themselves or who can't quite hold their train of thought or who brings everything back to the other parent's behaviour rather than focusing on the kids. The second presentation is what survival can look like. That's a nervous system that's been conditioned for years. That is someone who has learned, often painfully, that certain things might be dangerous to say, that certain emotions are dangerous to show, and who is now sitting across from a stranger being asked to be vulnerable about all of it. If the report writer doesn't have the lens to understand that, the conclusions that they draw can be catastrophically wrong. This is not a criticism of every report writer. There are very skilled report writers, very thoughtful practitioners who do this work with genuine care and skill. There can be reports that are nuanced and analytically sophisticated, but the system is very inconsistent, and protective parents need to understand that inconsistency before they walk into that room. This is just one of the reasons why some of the work that I do is actually in helping parents to prepare for meeting with report writers. Let's talk about the real criteria because, quote, be honest and you'll be fine, which is what a lot of parents get told by their lawyers, is really not strategic instruction, it's a platitude. Report writers are assessing a range of qualities and they're doing it across the interview, the observation with the kids and their review of the documents. They're paying attention to what you say it, how you look, how you present. One of the things that they can be looking for is protective capacity. Can you identify risk? Do you have strategies? Are you responsive to your children's needs? This is not about whether you can articulate that the other parent's dangerous. It's about whether you demonstrate that you can keep your children physically, emotionally and psychologically safe. The less helpful version sounds like, quote, I'm terrified for the children. He's dangerous and I can't trust anything. A more helpful version sounds like, I've noticed that after changeovers, my daughter in particular can be dysregulated for 2 or even 3 days. I've got some strategies to help her calm and settle. We've got a consistent routine, and she has a counsellor that she sees fortnightly. But I do really have concerns about the current arrangements because I've observed specific things that suggest that she's not emotionally safe in that environment. Same concern, different wording, completely different impact. Report writers can also be looking for insight and reflection. Can you reflect honestly on your own parenting? Can you acknowledge moments when you could have done things differently? Not to perform humility, but to demonstrate that you are truly a person who is genuinely aware of yourself and growing. A parent who says, quote, I'm the only one who has ever known these children, I've done all the things, is raising flags. A parent who says, quote, I know there have been moments when my anxiety has shown, and I've really been working on that specifically because I know that the kids need me to be regulated, that response demonstrates maturity. Report writers can be looking for child-focused thinking. Every answer, or at the very least most of your answers, should connect in some way, shape or form back to your children's needs. Not adult fairness, not what you think you deserve, not what the other parent did wrong, rather what your children need, their safety, their developmental needs, their stability, their emotional lives. This is the lens through which good report writers, competent report writers should be filtering everything. And when parents can demonstrate that they genuinely hold that lens, that can be very powerful. Report writers can be looking for the co-parenting dynamics and the nature of the co-parenting communication. This is where protective parents can get into trouble. Report writers can be assessing your ability to communicate and cooperate with the other parent, and in theory, a well-trained report writer can distinguish between high conflict dynamics where both parties might be contributing and coercive control dynamics where one party has good reason to maintain firm, boundaried, parallel communication. In practice, a parent who says, quote, I don't engage with the other parent directly because I've learned that engaging escalates things, needs to be able to explain that calmly and with specific examples. If it sounds like avoidance without an appropriate rationale, it can be misread, and a protective parent can instead run the risk of being framed as being uncooperative. Report writers can be assessing emotion regulation. And this brings me to something that I want to spend a bit more time on because it's where the neuroscience meets the practical reality of this process in a way that I think is not often spoken about. What many people don't fully understand about what happens when you sit down with a report writer is that if you've been in a relationship that's involved coercive control, other forms of family violence, or even just prolonged high conflict, your nervous system has adapted. And as we've discussed in other episodes, that's not a flaw, that's biology. That's what nervous systems are designed to do when they're in chronic threat environments. They develop rapid, automatic responses designed to keep you safe. The problem is that those same responses can work against you in a setting like a family report interview. When your threat response activates, when the amygdala fires and the body floods with cortisol, your prefrontal cortex goes offline. And your prefrontal cortex is exactly where the skills you need actually live. The ability to clearly articulate, sequential thinking, emotional regulation, the ability to stay child-focused and measured under pressure. So you can have every fact at your disposal. You can know exactly what you want to say. And then you're asked a difficult question, maybe a question about allegations that the other parent has made about you, or about why the children are reluctant to go for changeovers, or about why you haven't been responding to the other parent's communication directly, and your body can respond as though you're in danger, and everything that you've been preparing to say can vanish. This is a conditioned physiological response. A genuinely well-trained report writer should be able to understand that dynamic and make allowances for it. But we have to be strategic about this because not every report writer is well trained. Not every report writer is going to pick up on subtle nuances, which is why regulation preparation, not just performance preparation, but genuine nervous system preparation, is truly one of the most important things you can do before that interview. Slow breathing, grounding techniques, having physical anchors in the room, practicing pausing before you respond, slowing down your rate of speech, visualizing your children, learning to notice when your system is becoming activated and having a simple technique to bring yourself back. The guide on preparing for your family report assessment has specific grounding scripts and techniques for before, during and after the interview. But I want you to understand the why behind them, because when you understand why they work, when you understand that slow breathing literally brings your prefrontal cortex back online, you're more likely to actually use them in the moment. It's also important to note that regulation is not the same as suppression. You're not trying to pretend that you're not frightened. You're not trying to be calm in a performative way. You're trying to keep enough of yourself online in order to be able to speak your truth clearly. And that is a skill that can be developed and practiced. There's an area of the system that has some very real blind spots that protective parents need to be aware of. When a report writer encounters a case with significant, quote, conflict, there's a temptation, even in the best trained practitioners, to apply a framework that treats both parties as contributing equally to that dynamic. The, quote, high conflict couple framework. Both parents are in conflict. Conflict is harmful to kids. Therefore, the solution is to reduce the conflict and encourage cooperation. In genuinely mutual conflict situations, that framework might be appropriate. But when one party has been using coercive control, when the conflict is not mutual but manufactured, when one person is strategically creating conditions for the other to react, and then framing that reaction as evidence of some kind of instability, applying a mutual conflict framework is not neutral. It both disadvantages the protective parent as well as being potentially harmful to the protective parent and the children. What it can mean in practice is that the person who's calm, cooperative and strategic in the interview can read as the more reasonable parent. The person who's dysregulated, who might contradict themselves, who can't quite contain the reality of what they've lived through, they can read as the higher conflict person. And the reality is that perpetrators of coercive control can often be extraordinarily skilled at presenting well. And this isn't an accident. Coercive control operates through the management of perception. The same skills that allowed them to control the relationship, the ability to appear reasonable, calm and cooperative to the outside world, while behind closed doors the reality, the dynamic is completely different. Those skills don't disappear when in a meeting with a report writer. In fact, that's precisely where they can be the most effectively deployed. This is another reason why framing people who are good at image management as narcissists is such a problem. Because I would go so far as to say that the vast majority of people who perpetrate coercive control can also be incredibly skilled at image management. You don't need to be a narcissist to be able to manage your image, to be able to manage how you present to other people. Now, I'm not saying any of this to make you feel hopeless. I'm saying it so that if this is your situation, you've got a better understanding of what you're actually navigating, so that you can understand why the framing of your responses matters so much, so that you can consider seeking support before meeting with a report writer. I want you to understand why staying calm, factual, specific and child-focused is not just good advice, it's also strategic advice. It's the thing that can most directly counter the presentation advantage that a coercively controlling former partner might have. Specific, factual, and observable. Now I want to chat about some of the most common patterns that I see, because these are the things that can undermine your credibility even when your concerns are completely legitimate. The first is focusing on the other parent more than you are focusing on the children. The silent question in many report writers' minds is, how does this relate to the children's best interests? If your answers are primarily about what the other parent did wrong rather than what your kids need, you're not actually answering the question that they're really asking. So most of your responses should find its way back to the kids, their safety, their age and developmental needs, their emotional lives, your attunement to that, what you do to support them, what you've observed, what you're seeking for them, and why. It can be powerful when you can link what you're seeking in parenting orders to your response to particular questions. Something that you should not do is to use diagnostic language unless there has actually been a formal diagnosis of your former partner. And I cannot stress this enough. Do not ever use terms like narcissist, psychopath, borderline, or any other clinical diagnosis unless there has been a formal professional assessment. Even then, be careful. Using diagnostic language about a co-parent when meeting with a report writer can absolutely be treated as evidence of poor insight, inability to communicate without hostility, and a lack of child focus. Rather, describe the patterns of behaviour and the impact of those behaviours on you and on the children. You don't need to mention a diagnosis, but rather you let the behaviour patterns speak for themselves. Something else to avoid is over-explaining and defending. When we feel accused, our instinct is to defend ourselves, to explain, to make sure the other person understands. In a family report interview, this can come across as anxiety, reactivity, an inability to stay grounded, defensiveness. It's important to keep answers concise and factual. If things are put to you from the other parent's affidavit that are not accurate, you can address that briefly and specifically and then bring it back to the children. You need to avoid any perception that you have coached the children. This is one of the most significant credibility risks in the entire process. If a child says something in the interview that sounds rehearsed, if they use language that doesn't match their age or developmental level, if they repeat something that sounds more like an adult's characterization rather than their own experience, that's likely going to be noted by the report writer, and it can significantly damage your credibility regardless of whether the underlying concern is real. Your children need to feel free to speak their own truth and to not advocate for you or the other parent. In ideal circumstances, what they say will genuinely reflect their reality. It's also important not to disclose too much too quickly. The interview is conversational, but it does have a structure, and it's important to let the report writer guide it. You don't have to tell your entire story in the first 10 minutes. When you front load too much, when you arrive with a list or launch into a chronological account of all the things since separation, you can come across as someone who's prepared in an overmanaged way rather than someone who's genuinely present. Prepare your key messages, have some examples ready in your mind, and let the conversation unfold. Something else that can impact credibility that comes up a lot with people that I work with is when what they're saying in terms of their safety concerns, the family violence that has occurred during the relationship, or other things that impact safety. For example, it can be drug and alcohol use, it can be concerns about mental health, there can be suicidal ideation in the history of the other parent. When there are those things in your affidavit, those things that you're prepared to talk about, and yet when what you're seeking in parenting orders does not actually reflect that you're deeply concerned about safety, that creates a lot of questions about credibility. The problem that a lot of clients bring to me is that their lawyer is really pushing them down a path of offering a lot more time for the children to spend with the other parent, so as to appear flexible, so as to appear reasonable, so as to give the impression that you're open to encouraging the relationship between the children and the other parent. Now, I need to state here that this is not legal advice or individual coaching for anyone's circumstances. But as I said, this is why a lot of clients come to us, because there is a really big discrepancy between what they believe is safe for their children with the concerns that have been articulated in their affidavit and what their lawyer is encouraging them to propose in terms of what they're seeking in interim interlocutory orders and also on a final basis. When things don't align, when you've genuinely got significant concern and yet you're being asked to put all of this parenting time on the table or to move away from supervised time to unsupervised or to add overnight time or increase the number of overnights, it creates a situation in which a professional is going to be really confused about whether you have safety concerns or not. Because if you did, why would you be seeking all of this extra parenting time for your kids to be with the other parent? This is something that needs to be explored. As I said, this is why a lot of people reach out to me in particular. They're trying to make sense of what their concerns are and the concerns that are articulated in their affidavit and what their lawyer is encouraging them to seek on the basis of appearing reasonable. It may very well appear reasonable, but when there's genuine safety concerns, seeking particular parenting time to appear reasonable can then directly contradict the safety concerns, which can then severely undermine the credibility of the parent. This is something that you really have to be carefully considering when you're thinking about what you're wanting to seek in parenting orders. It's important that you're clear on this so that you can then give your lawyer clear instructions. And as I've said in other episodes, it's so important that you become the expert in your own case. In some situations, you might like to seek alternative legal opinions. In some situations, you might like to book an appointment with a coach, such as myself or someone else on my team, so that you can then get clear on what it is that you think is safe for your kids. Because at the end of the day, it is your responsibility to instruct the lawyer, not your lawyer's responsibility to instruct you. They can, of course, guide you, advise you, that's their job. But if you're being pushed into something on the basis of it appearing reasonable, but it then completely dismisses safety concerns that you genuinely have, and if those safety concerns have been mentioned in your affidavit, you can then run a very real strategic risk that a report writer is going to look at all this and see a really big mismatch. Again, if this is something that you're struggling with in your situation, I strongly recommend that you reach out to me or someone on my team so that we can help you to get clear so that you can then make a truly informed decision. It's really important to understand that a child impact report, so a short form report or a full family report, a long form report, none of those things are court orders. They're not judicial decisions. They're one piece of evidence that sits alongside all of the other evidence in your matter. If your case reaches a final trial and if no consent is reached at any point throughout that final trial, and so then the judge must make the final decision, that judge is legally required to analyse the report carefully and weigh it alongside everything else. The affidavits, the subpoenaed information, the cross-examination testimony, submissions from legal representatives, their own assessment of the credibility of witnesses, including you and the other parent. And judges do diverge from report recommendations. It's not uncommon. A judge who hears a parent give evidence in cross-examination, who sees them under real pressure, who hears the story told in their own voice, who can test the account of the other parent in the same way, has access to a dimension of the case that a report writer conducting a series of structured interviews in a limited period of time simply doesn't have. The report is a snapshot. It's one professional's view, formed over a very limited period of time in a highly artificial context. That doesn't mean that nothing in that report should be taken seriously, but it's certainly not definitive. The problem is that it's often treated as though it is definitive, not by the judge, but by your legal team. And this is what I think we need to be really direct about, because when a family report is released, the recommendations are often treated by legal professionals as an outcome. The ICL, the independent children's lawyer, whose role is ostensibly to advocate for the children's best interests, will in many cases simply align their position with the report's recommendations. This is so incredibly common. The other party's lawyer, if the recommendations align with what their client's seeking, can use the report to argue that the case has now pretty much been decided. Sometimes the protective parent's own lawyer won't push back on that much. What this can mean in practice is that enormous pressure can then fall on the protective parent to, quote, be reasonable or be realistic, to accept a proposal based on the report's recommendations, even when those recommendations are only one part of the puzzle, even when they don't reflect the full picture, even when there can be inconsistencies and contradictions within the report, even when the report writer may have applied a lens that was not fully appropriate to the dynamics at play, for example, completely missing coercive control. A well-prepared legal team and a genuinely strategic and analytical lawyer should be reading the report carefully, looking for internal inconsistencies, interrogating the methodology, examining whether the recommendations are logically supported by the body of the report, identifying where a different lens might have produced different conclusions, and if the case goes to trial, preparing to test those same things in court. But many don't do that, not because they're bad lawyers, but because the system creates enormous incentives around early resolution, and child impact reports and family reports are one of the most powerful tools for creating the conditions for early resolution. I'm not telling you this so that you don't trust your legal team. I'm telling you this so that you can have an informed conversation with them, so that if your report doesn't reflect your reality, you're not simply told it is what it is and expected to make a decision while you're still processing the shock of what you've read. You are allowed to have a much deeper conversation with your lawyer, particularly if there are inconsistencies in the report, if you've got concerns about things that the report writer didn't address, if you've got legitimate questions. A good lawyer should be able to answer your questions in a way that is not dismissive. I've supported many parents who have ultimately held on despite not having the recommendations that they were hoping for in a report, who went on to a final hearing, who gave evidence, and who came out the other side with orders that actually protected their kids. Oftentimes orders that looked nothing like the report recommendations. The report is just one part of the process. It's not the end. We've talked a lot today about the systemic picture, what report writers can be looking for, where the gaps are, why the report is not the verdict. For practical preparation, the Preparing for Your Family Report Assessment Guide was created specifically for this. It's comprehensive, it's honest, and it's grounded in both the experience of having been through the system myself and the experience of having supported hundreds of clients through it. It will take you through the core qualities that report writers assess, with worked examples of how to frame responses in ways that are credible, calm and child-focused. It has a language and framing sheet that gives you some direct rewrites, not scripts, but rather some anchors for the kinds of emotionally loaded statements that can come out wrong under pressure. It has some grounding techniques for before, during and after the interview, with the neuroscience behind why they work. This guide is available at danielleblackcoaching.com.au in the shop, It's also in the Post-Separation Parenting Blueprint. It lives in Module 21, Legal Considerations, in the bonus resources. If you want personalised support to prepare, if you want to work through your specific case, practice some responses, develop a strategy for how you might show up, Trudy and I offer one-on-one coaching sessions specifically designed for family report preparation. You can book a session with either Trudy or myself by going to the website danielleblackcoaching.com.au, going to Services in the main menu, navigating to one-on-one coaching, and from there you can use the direct link to book a time on our calendar. So to wrap this up, yes, family reports matter. They can be a significant part of contested family law proceedings. It is important to take them seriously, to prepare properly, to show up regulated, child-focused, specific and grounded. But they are not the last word. They are one professional's assessment formed in a limited time through an imperfect lens. They sit alongside all of the other evidence. And if yours doesn't reflect your reality, if it misses dynamics that you know are real and that have real consequences for your children, that is worth examining carefully before you accept any outcome based on it. Ask the questions, read the body of the report, not just the recommendations. Look for inconsistencies. Understand what the judge can and cannot do with report recommendations. Make informed decisions. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being here with me for this conversation. I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
There's a moment where the noise stops landing, where the chaos loses its hold.
That's it for today's episode of the Post-Separation Abuse Podcast. If you found this helpful, you'll love the Post-Separation Parenting Blueprint, the foundation of everything that my team and I teach, now available to all protective parents. Whether you work with us one-on-one or navigate your journey independently, the blueprint is where everyone starts. Whether you're thinking about separating, in the early stages of separation, wanting to avoid your kids being trapped with unsafe or inappropriate care arrangements, or perhaps needing to challenge and change current arrangements, and even if you're currently in the court system for parenting matters. I created the blueprint as a gift to all of my fellow protective parent warriors because the journey of being a change maker and a cycle breaker can't be done alone. And the blueprint is the one post-separation parenting resource that gets it right. Child development, safety and well-being put first, with the evidence to back it up. The blueprint gives you the same strategic frameworks that my team and I use in private one-on-one coaching. And it's available on an online platform for you to access whenever and wherever you need. You can also ensure that you're up to date with any new announcements by checking in regularly to the website danielleblackcoaching.com.au. Until next time, take care. And please always remember, you are your child's greatest protector.
This isn't revenge, this is design. A future rewritten line by line. You don't burn it down, you build it right with wisdom, strategy, and quiet mind.